In a street lined with old trees and identical mailboxes, there was a house that was quieter than all the others. The lawn was cut to a perfect, uniform length. The windows were so clean, they looked like they weren't there at all. And in this house lived a woman. She was the street's unofficial historian. She knew when the garbage truck was due, down to the minute. She knew which neighbor's dog barked at 3 a.m. And she knew, from her post behind her living room curtains, everything that happened on her quiet block. Her life was a routine. Coffee at 6 a.m., wiping counters at 7 a.m., watching the street from 8 a.m. until the mail arrived. Her world was small, orderly, and exactly how she liked it. Any disturbance, any sound out of place, was not just an annoyance, it was a personal offense. For 6 long months, the house directly across from her had been empty. The for sale sign had bleached in the sun. She had enjoyed the quiet. The emptiness. Then, one Tuesday, a massive roaring truck appeared, and her peace was shattered. It wasn't just a car. It was a moving truck, the biggest one she had ever seen. And it was parked right in front of her house, blocking her view. She felt a tightening in her chest. Then, the people came. It wasn't a quiet couple. It was a crowd. A man, a woman, 3 children who seemed to bounce out of the car, and an older woman who she assumed was a grandmother. They weren't quiet. They laughed. They shouted to each other from the truck to the house. The sound of their voices, full of life and excitement, echoed down the silent street. To the woman watching, it sounded like an invasion. She watched them for hours. They carried boxes. They dropped things. The children, a boy and 2 younger girls, ran onto the lawn. They were running on the grass, chasing each other, their sneakers tearing up the, admittedly patchy yard. The woman in the quiet house flinched. The father was a big man. He was loud. He was directing the movers, his voice booming as he said, "Careful with that one. And just put it in the living room." The mother was everywhere, holding a baby and pointing, a smile on her face that never seemed to fade. The neighbor watched, and she judged. "No respect," she muttered to her empty kitchen. "They have no respect for the neighborhood. This isn't a playground." The moving truck finally left, but the noise didn't. The family was in the house now. She could hear the faint thump-thump of music. She could hear the children squealing. The next few days were a special kind of torture for her. The family was settling in. This meant the garage door was always open, revealing a mess of boxes and tools. It meant the father was outside, trying to fix a broken shutter, and whistling while he did it. It meant the mother was often in the front yard, playing with the children, their laughter like little alarms going off in the neighbor's head. She started a mental list. Monday, they left their empty moving boxes on the curb a full day before pickup. Tuesday, the little boy rode his tricycle on the sidewalk. Her sidewalk. Wednesday, they had visitors. 2 cars she didn't recognize. Thursday, the smell of their cooking. It was strong. Not the simple boiled scent of her own kitchen. It was something else. Something foreign. Every small thing was, to her, a piece of evidence. Evidence that these people were not like her. They were not quiet. They were not orderly. They were a problem. She found herself watching them constantly. She knew when they left. She knew when they returned. She saw the father leave for work early each morning in a simple dark blue car. He always waved to the mailman. He always smiled at other neighbors. But the woman watching didn't smile back. She just watched. Then, the flyers went out. She found one tucked into her mail slot. It was bright pink with cartoon balloons on it. "You're invited." It shouted in cheerful, bubbly letters. "Come celebrate our son's 10th birthday. This Saturday. 3 p.m., our backyard." The woman held the pink paper as if it were contaminated. A party? Here? On her street? She had a terrible, sinking feeling. This wasn't going to be a small, quiet affair with cake and ice cream. This family didn't do small or quiet. And on Saturday morning, her worst fears were confirmed. A truck arrived and dropped off a huge inflatable castle. It inflated with a loud whoosh, a dragon of a thing right in their backyard. Then, the cars started to arrive. Not 1 or 2, but 5, then 10, then 15. The street was clogged with cars she had never seen before. And then, the music started. It wasn't gentle. It was a deep, rhythmic bass that pulsed through the air. The neighbor could feel it in her clean, quiet house. She could feel it in her chest. And it was only 3:15 p.m. She gripped the edge of her curtains. Her peaceful Saturday was ruined. But she had no idea that by the end of the night, her whole world would be. The clock on her wall, a quiet tick-tock that usually soothed her, was now completely drowned out. The sound from across the street was not just music anymore. It was a physical thing. It was a vibration. She could feel it in the floorboards. She swore she saw a teacup on her shelf rattle. She had closed all her windows, but it did no good. The sound seemed to come right through the glass, through the walls, and into her head. Thump, thump, from her post at the living room window. She watched the party with a growing sense of panic. It was not a party. It was a circus. The inflatable castle in the back was a monstrosity, and the children on it were not playing. They were shrieking. They screamed as they slid down, their voices high and sharp like little alarms. The backyard was a sea of people. She tried to count them. 20, 30. She lost count as they moved around, laughing and holding paper plates. They were strangers. All of them. Strangers taking over her street. Then, the smoke came. A thick, white cloud of it rose from the backyard. Barbecue. It smelled sweet and greasy, and she hated it. The smoke drifted across the street, a hazy invasion, and she had to turn on the fan in her kitchen to fight the smell. Who do they think they are? She thought, her hands gripping the kitchen counter. Forcing us all to smell their food. Hear their noise. She was a prisoner in her own home. As the afternoon light began to fade, a new horror set in. The party wasn't stopping. Surely, she thought, it has to end soon. It's a child's birthday. They'll get tired, but she was wrong. As the sky turned from blue to orange, a new set of lights flickered to life across the street. Strings of colorful bulbs had been hung along their fence. The music, which she prayed would fade, seemed to get louder. The beat changed. The deep thump-thump was joined by a higher energy rhythm. The adults were dancing now. On the lawn. On the driveway. She watched, her face a mask of disbelief. This was not just a disturbance. This was a violation. A violation of the peace, of the rules, of the simple, decent quiet that she had worked her entire life to build and protect. She began to pace. From the living room window to the kitchen window, then back again. Each lap made her angrier. "This is not right," she said out loud, her voice sounding strange in the quiet room. "This is not allowed." She watched a car she didn't recognize pull up. It parked awkwardly, its rear tire on the edge of another neighbor's lawn. She fumed. No respect. No respect for anyone's property. What if there was an emergency? What if a fire truck needed to get through? This thought latched onto her mind and began to grow. An emergency. What if this was an emergency? What if all this chaos, all this noise, was just a cover for something else? All these people. Who were they? The father, the one who was always whistling and waving. Maybe he wasn't just a friendly new neighbor. Her mind, fueled by hours of thumping bass and her own rising anxiety, started to build a new story. The noise wasn't a party. It was a disturbance. The smoke wasn't barbecue. It was a hazard. The crowds weren't friends. They were a mob. She was no longer just an annoyed neighbor. She was a concerned citizen, She was the only one brave enough to see the truth. She was the protector of the neighborhood. It was fully dark now. 8 p.m. The party was still going. She sat in her dark living room, the flashing colors from the party lights dancing on her walls. Her head was pounding. She felt sick. She had to do something. She had to. She watched as a group of people gathered in the front yard, near the street. They were laughing. The father was with them, holding something up. And then, a sound, pop. It was sharp, louder than the music. It wasn't a balloon. It was too deep, too sudden. Her heart stopped. She waited, breathless. The music continued. The people were still laughing. Then another one, pop. She jumped, her hand flying to her chest. That was it. That was not a balloon. It was something else. Firecrackers? A car backfiring? Or something worse. Her mind flashed to the worst possible conclusion. In her world, the world she had built of suspicion and fear, that pop was all the proof she needed. Her decision was made. The annoyance, the anger, the fear. It all came together in one single terrible moment of clarity. This was not a party. This was a danger. She turned away from the window, her back to the flashing lights. She walked through her dark, quiet house, her footsteps silent on the carpet. She picked up the phone. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. From righteousness. She knew the number by heart. She dialed. The woman's voice was shaky, but her words were firm. She had practiced them in her head. "There is a major disturbance on my street," she said, her voice low. "It's completely out of control. So many people. Loud, frightening noises. I think I heard something. Something that sounded dangerous." She gave the address. The dispatcher was professional. "Officers are on their way, ma'am. Please stay on the line." But the neighbor hung up. She didn't need to stay on the line. Her part was done. She had acted. She had protected the neighborhood. She walked with a strange, cold calm back to her living room window. She parted the curtains just a fraction. Now she just had to wait and watch justice arrive. It didn't take long. 5 minutes later, the pulsing, thumping beat of the music was torn apart by a new sound. A sound that cut through the night. W-O-O-W-O-O-W-O-O. The police cars, their blue and red lights flashing, turned onto the street. They didn't use their full sirens, but the flashing lights were enough. They lit up the entire block, painting the houses, the trees, and the stunned faces of the party-goers in strokes of red and blue. The music across the street died instantly. The sudden heavy silence was more shocking than the noise had been. The neighbor watched, her heart pounding, as all the people in the front yard froze. They turned, confused, towards the police cars. 2 officers got out. Their movements were cautious, their hands near their belts. They had been told this was a dangerous situation. The front door of the house opened, and the father stepped out onto the porch. The mother was right behind him, her hand on his arm, her face pale with worry. "Is there a problem, officers?" the father asked. His voice was calm, but the neighbor could see the tension in his shoulders. "Sir, we received a 911 call about a major disturbance," the first officer said. His voice was loud, official. "Reports of a chaotic scene, uncontrolled, and possible dangerous noises." The father looked genuinely baffled. "Dangerous noises? Officer, this is my son's 10th birthday party. The families are starting to leave." The dangerous noise was probably the kids popping leftover balloons. The second officer shined his flashlight into the backyard. He could see the deflating inflatable castle, the strings of party lights, the half-eaten cake on a table. It did not look like a chaotic scene. It looked like the end of a birthday party. "We have to take every call seriously, sir," the first officer said, though his tone was softening. "The report we got, well, it sounded a lot worse than this." The neighbor, watching from her window, felt a sudden cold prickle of doubt. Why were they being so nice? Why weren't they doing anything? The father sighed. He looked incredibly tired. He looked at the police officers, then he looked up, past them, and his eyes seemed to find the exact dark window where the neighbor was hiding. "I understand," the father said slowly. "You have to do your job. Just wait right here. I don't want any trouble for my family." He turned and went back inside the house. The neighbor's heart leaped. "He's hiding. He's running." She thought, vindicated. "They have him." The officers tensed, exchanging a nervous look. "Sir?" One called out. A moment later, the front door opened again. The dad walked back out onto the porch, standing under the bright porch light. He was the same man, but everything was different. He had put on a heavy, official-looking navy blue jacket. It had reflective stripes on the arms and an official patch on the shoulder. He held up a small leather-bound ID for the officers to see. The neighbor squinted, leaning so hard against the glass her breath made a fog. She couldn't read the patch. But she saw the change in the police officers. They froze. They both stood up straight. Their whole attitude, their entire posture, changed in an instant. "Oh," the first officer said, his voice now full of embarrassment. "Oh, Captain, we had no idea. We are so sorry, Captain." The father, the man she had called the cops on, was the fire captain for the city's 12th precinct. The strangers at his party were his firefighters, his fellow first responders, and their families. The officer who had spoken turned his head. He didn't look at the father. He looked directly across the street. He looked right at the neighbor's window, and though he couldn't see her, she felt his stare like a physical blow. He knew exactly who had made that call. The neighbor stumbled back from the window. Her face was burning hot with a shame so intense it made her dizzy. A fire captain. A man who ran into burning buildings. A man who saved lives. A man whose son's 10th birthday party she had just tried to ruin by calling 911. She saw the officers apologizing to the captain. She saw the captain shake his head, wave them off, and go back to his family. The police cars, their lights now off, quietly pulled away. The party was over. The guests left quickly, not laughing anymore. They walked past her house, and she hid in the shadows, certain they were all staring, all whispering. The street was finally quiet. It was the perfect, orderly silence she had always wanted. But as she stood alone in her dark, empty house, the silence was deafening. It was no longer peaceful. It was the sound of her own huge, terrible mistake.